The roar fades first. It always does. The 80,000 voices, the clamor of the band, the sharp blast of the official's whistle. They recede into a muffled hum, and then into nothing. What remains is a different soundscape. The ringing in your own ears, the labored, wet gasp of your breath fighting through a crushed chest, the sickening, dull throb in a knee that no longer bends the way nature intended. And beneath it all, a silence so profound it feels less like an absence of noise and more like a presence. A new, permanent resident in the rooms of your mind. This is the moment after. This is where our story begins. Not with a championship celebration, not with a trophy raised under confetti, but here, in the lingering echo of the last play of a career. For many men who played professional football in the 1930s, there was no ceremonial retirement. There was only a final season, a last game, a specific, often unremarkable play that served as the unmarked border between who they were and what they would become. The final season was not a celebration of a journey's end. It was the year the game took something essential from them, something they would spend the rest of their lives trying and failing to retrieve. I think of Joe Donahue, a name now lost to even the most dedicated archives. A lineman for the Pittsburgh Pirates, as they were called before the Steelers in 1934. He was 26 years old. In a game against the Giants, a routine play, a collision at the line. He fell, got up, walked to the sideline and sat down. He complained of a headache. They gave him smelling salts. He played the rest of the game. That night he collapsed at home. He was dead by morning. A cerebral hemorrhage. The newspapers called it a tragic accident, a fluke of violent sport. They did not call it a consequence. They did not ask what a 26-year-old man's brain must have looked like before that final play. They did not tally the hundreds of smaller, unseen collisions that came before it, the tiny traumas that weakened the vessel until it burst. Joe Donahue's final season was 1934. His final game was that day. His final play was that collision. And the price was everything. Then there is the slower, more insidious theft. I think of Jack McCarthy, a running back for the Chicago Cardinals. A shifty, durable player from 1931 to 1937. He was known for his toughness, for popping up quickly after vicious hits. He left the game with a limp and headaches he dismissed as just part of the deal. The man who retired was not the man who aged. In his 40s, the headaches became migraines that left him bedridden in dark rooms. His personality changed. The easygoing former athlete grew irritable, paranoid, prone to sudden rages his family did not recognize. He struggled to hold jobs. His memory, once sharp, began to fail him. He would get lost driving familiar routes. By his 60s, he was a ghost of his former self, living in a confused and agitated inner world his children could not reach. Jack McCarthy's final season was 1937, but the game was not done with him. It had planted something in those years, a silent, ticking clock that continued its work long after the crowds found new heroes to cheer. Took his past, then his present, and finally his very mind. These men were not outliers. They were the rule. The 1930s National Football League was not the corporate titan we know today. It was a precarious, gritty, Depression-era scrap for survival. It was a league of dirt fields, leather helmets, and a code of conduct written not in a rulebook, but in blood and gritted teeth. The spectacle sold to the few thousand fans in the stands was one of sheer, unvarnished gladiatorial combat. And the currency of that spectacle was the human body. The players understood the bargain, or thought they did. A few dollars per game, a chance to extend their love of sport, a fleeting taste of glory. They did not understand the compound interest of the debt they were incurring. Every dinger, every bell ringing, every twisted knee walked off, every split lip taped shut, was a withdrawal from an account they could never replenish. The language of the time sanitized the carnage. They spoke of intestinal fortitude, of heart, of gameness. They did not speak of traumatic brain injury, of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, of degenerative arthritis, of spinal stenosis. The vocabulary for their suffering would not be invented for decades. By then, for so many, it would be too late. The silence after the roar. Then, becomes a metaphor for their lives. The public adulation, what little there was fleeting. The headlines moved on. The league moved on. But the private aftermath was a lifelong sentence served in quiet, painful increments. It was the sound of a man groaning as he lowered himself into a bath, his body a map of ancient fractures and torn ligaments. It was the sound of a wife pleading with her husband to remember their anniversary, to recognize their grandchild. It was the sound of a teacup shaking in a saucer held by hands that once stiff-armed linebackers. It was the sound of a memory disappearing, a personality dissolving, a life narrowing to the four walls of a room where the pain was a constant companion. So we must ask the uncomfortable, haunting question. What did this league, in its formative, most ruthless years, truly do to the men who built it? We have celebrated the legends, the Hall of Famers, the pioneers whose names grace the record books. But what of the others? The journeymen, the substitutes, the human fodder for the weekly spectacle? What did it take from them? And more crucially, how did the very structure of the NFL in the 1930s, a league born in the desperation of the Great Depression, engineer a system that not only allowed for such destruction but actively depended upon it? This is not a story about football as a game. This is a forensic examination of football as a dangerous, unregulated industry at its moment of inception. This is about the creation of a culture that valued toughness over health, spectacle over safety, and the weekly product over the lifelong well-being of the men who produced it. We are about to step onto those dusty, rock-hard fields. We are about to enter those sparse, cold locker rooms. We are about to meet the men who, for a few dollars a week, offered up their futures. This is the story of the final season that never ended. This is the story of how the NFL's darkest legacy was written in its very first chapter. To understand the modern NFL, its perpetual crises over safety, its culture of silence, and its foundational morality, you must first understand the 1930s. This was not merely the league's first full decade of existence. It was its formative trauma, the crucible in which its very soul was forged. And that soul was forged in fire, in pain, and in a stark Depression-era calculus that placed survival above all else, especially above the well-being of the men on the field. This documentary will argue that the 1930s established the NFL's fundamental and often fatal relationship with danger. Every contemporary battle over concussions, player safety, and ethical responsibility is a ghostly echo of decisions made and priorities set in this desperate decade. We will journey back to a time when professional football was not a national institution, but a scrappy, peripheral sport fighting for oxygen in a choked economy. The men who played were not millionaire athletes. They were laborers, paid piecework for their pain, viewed by owners and a struggling public as expendable components in a weekly spectacle of sanctioned violence. In the absence of protective rules, of meaningful medical science, and of any ethical framework beyond profit, one currency became paramount: toughness. The league, consciously or not, sold violence as its primary product. And the men, with few alternatives and even less power, paid for it with their futures. The context is everything. The Great Depression did not simply provide a backdrop for the NFL. It defined its every operating principle. When a quarter of the workforce was unemployed, when breadlines stretched for blocks, the chance to earn even a meager wage playing a game held an irresistible coercive power. Franchises themselves were fragile entities, folding and relocating with alarming frequency. The players' leverage was non-existent. As Hall of Famer Mel Hein, a center for the New York Giants throughout the 30s, once bluntly put it, if you got hurt, they'd just find somebody to take your place. There were plenty of guys waiting. This was the core truth. Players were disposable, replaceable labor. Your body was your tool, and if it broke, you were not sent for repairs. You were discarded. The economic desperation of the time created a power imbalance so severe it bordered on predation. A player could not afford to say no. He could not afford to admit injury. To do so was to invite poverty, to surrender the only livelihood he might have. This economic coercion is the first pillar of our story, the engine that forced men to acquiesce to their own physical destruction. Upon this foundation of desperation, the league built a game of astonishing physical peril. The equipment was medieval. Leather helmets, if worn at all, offered no protection from impact. They were designed to prevent scalp lacerations, not to cushion the brain. They hardened in the cold and rotted in the rain. Shoulder pads were thin strips of felt. Knee braces were virtually unheard of. The playing surfaces were often literal rock-hard dirt or frozen turf, transforming every fall into a potential fracture. And the rules actively encouraged brutality. The forward pass was still a relative novelty, so the game was a relentless, ground-based war of attrition. Gang tackling, clipping, and brutal crackback blocks were all legal and routine. There was no such thing as defenseless receiver protection. Sports writers of the era, complicit in building the mythos, fed the narrative. A 1934 Chicago Tribune article described a typical play not as a tactical effort, but as a savage collision of masses, praising the maniacal fury of the combatants. The violence was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was the featured attraction. Into this arena walked the medical profession, or more accurately, a haunting facsimile of it. Team doctors were often local general practitioners volunteering for extra income, or worse, trainers with no formal medical education whatsoever. The concept of sports medicine did not exist. The diagnosis for a staggering hit to the head was uniform: get your bell rung. The treatment was smelling salts, a slap on the backside, and a command to return to the fray. Internal injuries, concussions, spinal trauma, these were mysteries, their symptoms viewed as signs of weakness to be overcome by willpower. Pain was the enemy to be annihilated, not a signal to be heeded. The medicine cabinet contained two primary tools: alcohol and opioids. Whiskey was a stimulant and a painkiller. Injections of morphine or its derivatives were given to mask catastrophic injury, allowing players to finish games on broken limbs or with ruptured organs. The goal was not healing. The goal was the facilitation of continued performance, regardless of the long-term cost to the human being. This systematic medical neglect is our second pillar. From this convergence, economic desperation, primitive violence, and medical abandonment, sprang the third and most enduring pillar: the culture. The play-through-anything culture. The shake-it-off culture. The culture that equated pain tolerance with manhood and injury confession with cowardice. This was not an organic development. It was a necessary adaptation to a hostile environment. To survive professionally, you had to embody this code. Coaches like the Chicago Bears' George Halas, a titan of the era, preached toughness as the supreme virtue. It was a Darwinian ecosystem within the locker room. To show vulnerability was to mark yourself for replacement. This created a code of silence more powerful than any contract, a brotherhood of suffering that bound men to their own destruction. They policed each other, glorified each other's pain, and in doing so, became willing participants in a system that consumed them. Over the next 15 chapters, we will dissect this system from every angle. We will start on the field itself in the Sunday Slaughterhouse, to understand the biomechanics of destruction with 1930s technology. We will follow the players on their grueling, nomadic travels across a bankrupt country. We will sit in the locker room with the doc and his black bag of archaic and often harmful remedies. We will delve into the era's total ignorance of head trauma, an ignorance that would plant seeds of a neurological catastrophe we are still harvesting today. We will deconstruct the Iron Man myth manufactured by the press, and examine the horrific playing conditions of mud, blood, and frozen earth. We will look at how the officials were complicit, how the owners crunched the numbers, and how the first lone voices of warning were shouted down. This journey will force us to confront uncomfortable legacies. We will meet the forgotten, those who died young and poor, their bodies used up. We will trace the slow-motion tragedy of men who lived long enough to see their minds and bodies betray them, abandoned by the league they helped build. And finally, we will draw the direct, unbroken line from the choices made in the 1930s to the existential crises facing the NFL today. This is not a nostalgic look at football's tough old days. This is an indictment of a business model that was born brutal. We are about to peel back the layers of myth and nostalgia to reveal the raw, unvarnished truth of what it cost to build this empire, one broken body at a time. The 1930s were not just a chapter in NFL history. They were the original sin. The modern football field is a precisely engineered surface. The grass is hybrid, the drainage perfect, the lines digitally straight. The equipment is space-age polymer and impact-absorbing foam. When we watch a game today, even with its known dangers, we are watching a contest that exists within a framework of calculated, if imperfect, risk mitigation. To step onto an NFL field in the 1930s was to enter a different realm of physics and physiology altogether. It was to volunteer your body for a weekly experiment in unregulated collision. I want you to imagine the sensory reality of it. First, the smell. The sour odor of sweat and liniment soaking into heavy wool jerseys that weigh down when wet, clinging like a sponge. The damp, earthy scent of mud, or the crisp, metallic tang of frozen air. Then the sound. Not the clean plastic crack of today, but a duller, more organic thud of leather, flesh, and bone meeting at full velocity. And finally, the feel. The rock-hard dirt of a neglected baseball diamond repurposed for football, where a fall could skin you to the bone or break a collarbone on impact. Or the frozen turf of late November, a surface like concrete that turned every tackle into a potential concussion. This was the arena. This was the Sunday slaughterhouse. The tools of the trade were laughably, tragically inadequate. The helmet is the most potent symbol. It was made of leather, usually brown, stretched over a simple web of suspension straps inside. There was no face mask. Your nose, mouth, and teeth were utterly exposed. In cold weather, the leather would stiffen, becoming less of a cushion and more of a brittle shell. In rain, it would soak through, sagging and heavy. Its primary purpose was not to absorb the kinetic energy of a collision to protect the brain. It was to prevent scalp lacerations and cauliflower ear. It was about keeping the surface of the head intact, while doing nothing to buffer the delicate organ within from slamming against the skull. Shoulder pads were thin strips of felt or leather, maybe a quarter-inch thick, offering the protection of a heavy winter coat. Knee pads were optional, and hip pads were often just folded towels stuffed into the uniform pants. Players wore minimal, if any, protective gloves. Their hands were raw, cracked, and bleeding by the fourth quarter. This was not armor. It was costume with the faintest pretense of padding. But the true danger was not just in what they lacked, but in what the rules actively encouraged. The game's legal framework was a blueprint for brutality. The forward pass, while legalized in 1906, was still viewed by many purists as a gimmick, a betrayal of football's core identity as a running, hitting sport. As a result, the game was a relentless interior grind. And at the heart of this grind were two perfectly legal tactics that turned every play into a potential car crash. The first was the crackback block. Today, it is illegal to block a defender below the waist if you are moving back toward your own end zone. In the 1930s, it was a staple. A receiver or running back would start downfield, then suddenly will back toward the line of scrimmage and launch himself, often at knee height, into an unsuspecting linebacker or defensive end who was pursuing the play. The defender, running full speed in the opposite direction, would have his legs taken out from under him. The injuries were catastrophic. Shredded knee ligaments, broken legs, ankle fractures. There was no penalty. It was considered clever, heads-up football. The second tactic was the era's philosophy on tackling, gang tackling, not just as a strategy but as a form of punctuation. Once a ball carrier was stopped, the play was not over. It was about keeping the surface of the head intact, while doing nothing to buffer the delicate organ within from slamming against the skull. Shoulder pads were thin strips of felt or leather, maybe a quarter-inch thick, offering the protection of a heavy winter coat. Knee pads were optional, and hip pads were often just folded towels stuffed into the uniform pants. Players wore minimal, if any, protective gloves. Their hands were raw, cracked, and bleeding by the fourth quarter. This was not armor. It was costume with the faintest pretense of padding. But the true danger was not just in what they lacked, but in what the rules actively encouraged. The game's legal framework was a blueprint for brutality. The forward pass, while legalized in 1906, was still viewed by many purists as a gimmick, a betrayal of football's core identity as a running, hitting sport. As a result, the game was a relentless interior grind. And at the heart of this grind were two perfectly legal tactics that turned every play into a potential car crash. The first was the crackback block. Today, it is illegal to block a defender below the waist if you are moving back toward your own end zone. In the 1930s, it was a staple. A receiver or running back would start downfield, then suddenly will back toward the line of scrimmage and launch himself, often at knee height, into an unsuspecting linebacker or defensive end who was pursuing the play. The defender, running full speed in the opposite direction, would have his legs taken out from under him. The injuries were catastrophic. Shredded knee ligaments, broken legs, ankle fractures. There was no penalty. It was considered clever, heads-up football. The second tactic was the era's philosophy on tackling, gang tackling, not just as a strategy but as a form of punctuation. Once a ball carrier was stopped, the play was not over. There was no discussion of cumulative damage, of long-term recovery. The body was seen as a machine that could be endlessly repaired with grit and courage. If a part broke, you taped it up. If you were knocked senseless, you took your smelling salts and went back in. The economics demanded it, the culture celebrated it, and the rules facilitated it. The playing field was not a gridiron. It was an industrial worksite where the human product was both the labor and the raw material being processed. Every Sunday, the machine was switched on, and men fed themselves into its gears. The sound it made was not the roar of the crowd, but the silent, internal snap of something giving way that would never truly heal. This was the baseline reality. This was the job. And when the final whistle blew on these weekly battles, the war was far from over. For the players, the next challenge was just beginning. The endless, penniless travel across a bankrupt nation, where your body was not your own, but a commodity to be transported until it broke down for good. To be a professional football player in the 1930s was to be a member of a traveling carnival. Not the glamorous, celebrated kind, but the desperate, gritty kind that rolled into a town, performed its spectacle for a pittance, and vanished before dawn, leaving only tire tracks and litter behind. There was no home, not really. There was only the next town, the next game, the next paycheck. The stability we associate with modern sports franchises, the iconic stadiums, the local community ties, the generational fandom, was a fantasy in that decade. The NFL was a league of phantoms and fugitives, where teams appeared, dissolved, or relocated overnight, and the players were less like athletes and more like migrant workers following a harvest of violence. This relentless transience was not a sidebar to the experience. It was a central, corrosive element that deepened the danger, amplified the isolation, and systematically stripped these men of any semblance of care, continuity, or control. First, consider the landscape of the league itself. Franchise mortality was staggeringly high. Between 1930 and 1939, over 20 different teams came and went. The Newark Tornadoes, the Staten Island Stapletons, the Portsmouth Spartans, the Cincinnati Reds. Teams would fold mid-season, their players suddenly unemployed, scrambling to catch on with another club if they were lucky. The Boston Redskins played to empty stands at Fenway Park and simply picked up and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1937, with no warning to the players beyond packing orders. This instability created a profound sense of impermanence. You could not build a life in a city because your city might cease to have a team by next fall. You were not building a legacy for a community. You were providing a temporary, disposable service for a business that might not exist next year. This fluidity extended to the players themselves through a practice that laid bare their true status as chattel. The player sale. There was no free agency, no collective bargaining, no sense that a man had autonomy over his own career. Owners bought and sold players from each other with the cold detachment of merchants trading livestock. A standout performance on a Saturday could result in a telegram on Monday informing you that you had been sold to a team on the opposite side of the country. You had no say. You reported or you forfeited your chance to play and earn anywhere. The story of Byron "Whizzer" White, a superstar of the era, is instructive. After a brilliant rookie season with the Pittsburgh Pirates in 1938, he was sold to the Detroit Lions for the then unheard of sum of $15,000. The money did not go to White. It went to the Pirates' owner. White, despite his fame, was merely an asset on a balance sheet, transferred for cash to bolster a struggling franchise. For lesser-known players, the sales were quieter, more brutal. A man could eat breakfast with teammates in Brooklyn and be on a train to Chicago by dinner, his relationships, his lodging, his entire context severed with a handshake between wealthy men. And then there was the travel itself. Air travel was for the Lindberghs of the world, not for football players. The journey was by rail, and it was a central, grinding feature of the existence. Teams would routinely embark on road trips that were less like business trips and more like military campaigns, spanning weeks and covering thousands of miles. The 1934 Chicago Bears, for instance, famously ended their season with a multi-game postseason barnstorming tour that took them from New York to Los Angeles to Miami, playing a mix of official games and exhibitions against all comers, all by train. Imagine the physical calculus of this. You play a brutal 60-minute game on a Sunday. That night or early Monday morning, you board a cramped, noisy, smoke-filled train car. You sleep or try to, in a seat or a shared berth, your body stiffening and swelling from the day's impacts. You eat poor food. You arrive in a new city, perhaps after days of travel, with no time for proper practice or acclimation, and you do it all again. Recovery was impossible. The travel compounded the injuries, denying the body the rest it desperately needed to repair even the most minor damage. A sprain became a chronic weakness. A bruise deepened. The cumulative fatigue eroded reaction time, making you more susceptible to the next big hit. This nomadic life severed the player from every traditional support system. There was no family doctor who knew your history, no community that offered a soft landing after a bad day, no stable home to heal in. You were cut off from the anchors of normal life. Furthermore, it prevented the formation of any consistent medical oversight. You might see one team's quasi-doctor one week, and another stranger with his black bag the next. There was no continuity of care, no medical record, no one tracking the cumulative toll on your body over time. You were a passing stranger to the very people tasked with patching you up. This isolation was psychological poison. The loneliness of those long train rides, the alienation of strange cities, the pressure of performing while in constant pain and exhaustion. It fed a mindset where the only identity that mattered was the one you carried on the field. You were a football player, nothing more and nothing less. When that was taken from you, either by injury or time, you were left with a profound emptiness, a rootless man without a craft or a community to return to. The traveling carnival did not just move men from game to game. It moved them away from themselves. It transformed the profession from a sport into a form of itinerant physical labor, where the worksite was constantly shifting, and the worker was forever a stranger. By design, this system prevented organization, collective action, or the building of any lasting power base. You couldn't unionize a ghost. You couldn't demand better safety protocols from an employer that might evaporate. You were in constant motion, and that motion served to keep you disoriented, disposable, and desperate enough to climb back onto that train, and then back onto that field, no matter what it cost you. And as the train wheels clattered over the rails, a more pervasive and inescapable pressure was tightening its grip on every man aboard. The sheer, stark economic terror of the Great Depression, which waited for them at every station, reminding them that no matter how brutal the carnival was, the alternative outside its gates was infinitely worse. The roar of the crowd, the clash of bodies, the myth of the gladiator. These were the abstractions. The reality was a number, a specific, pitifully small number written on a check, if you were lucky, or counted out in cash at the end of a game. To comprehend the decisions these men made, the risks they accepted, the pain they swallowed, you must first understand the arithmetic of their lives. The National Football League of the 1930s did not exist in a vacuum. It was a small, precarious island in the vast, dark sea of the Great Depression. And that sea exerted a pressure so immense, so inescapable, that it deformed every choice, every principle, every instinct for self-preservation. This was not merely a league where players were underpaid. This was a system of profound economic coercion, where the threat of absolute poverty was the ultimate enforcer, a silent partner on every sideline, compelling men to sacrifice their long-term health for short-term survival. Let us talk frankly about money. The mythology suggests that even in those days, star players did well. The truth is more nuanced and, for the vast majority, far more grim. At the very top of the pyramid was a player like Shipwreck Kelly, the charismatic New York Giants tailback. He was one of the highest paid players of the decade, earning about $6,000 per season at his peak. In Depression-era dollars, that was a strong upper-middle-class income. But Kelly was the exception, a celebrity in the nation's largest media market. For every Shipwreck Kelly, there were 50 journeymen. The average salary for a starting player on a major team was between $1,500 and $3,000 per season. Rookies and substitutes made far less, often as little as $75 to $100 per game. Now, place that against the backdrop of the economy. In 1935, the average annual wage for a full-time, year-round worker in the United States was about $1,500. A skilled auto worker at Ford might make $1,600. A professional football player, risking permanent disability, was earning roughly the same as a factory worker, but only for 3 months of the year. This is the crucial fracture. Football was not a year-round salary. It was seasonal, piecework labor. For the remaining 8 or 9 months, you were on your own in an economy with 25% unemployment. There was no off-season bonus, no workout stipend, no health insurance. That game check was not disposable income. It was a lifeline. It was rent, it was food, it was a chance to support parents or a young family. This created the central, brutal paradox of the 1930s player. His body was both his greatest asset and his only asset. And if that asset was sidelined, even for a week, the entire financial structure of his life collapsed. The choice presented was no choice at all. Play in pain or face destitution. A broken bone was a financial catastrophe. A concussion was a mortgage payment missed. This economic reality is what transformed the culture of toughness from a philosophy into a survival imperative. So they worked. The idea of a player dedicating his off-season to training and recovery is a modern luxury. In the 1930s, the off-season was a scramble for any job that could be found. They were manual laborers, construction workers, salesmen, bartenders. Many worked for their team's owner in some unrelated business. A car dealership, a brewery, a factory, a patron-client relationship that further bound them to the boss's whims. The physical toll of this double life was immense. Johnny Blood, the legendary Packers receiver and libertine, took off-season jobs as a railroad worker and a magazine subscription salesman, living a hobo existence. More typical was the lineman who spent his week loading crates in a warehouse or digging ditches, then showed up on Sunday physically depleted, his body already fatigued, more vulnerable to injury. They arrived at the stadium not as finely tuned athletes, but as working-class men already worn down by the struggle of daily life, asking their bodies to then perform supernatural feats of violence. The psychological pressure was a constant, grinding weight. There was no security, no safety net. Every practice, every scrimmage, carried the unspoken terror of a non-contact injury that could end your earning capacity in an instant. This fear made players complicit in their own mistreatment. You did not tell the coach your knee was loose. You did not mention the blinding headaches. To report an injury was to invite your release, to be labeled soft, and to be replaced by one of the hundreds of hungry, capable college stars who would gladly take your spot for half the pay. The owners and coaches understood this dynamic implicitly. It was a buyer's market for human talent. The leverage was all theirs. Former Cleveland Rams tailback Mike Sebastian once summarized the ethos with stark clarity. You get a broken nose, they grab it and pull it straight, stuff some gauze in it, and tell you to get back in there. What were you gonna do? Quit? And go do what? There was nothing out there. This coercion extended to the very way contracts were structured and medical care was handled. Teams would often withhold a player's final game check until after the season, ensuring he wouldn't jump to another club or complain too loudly. Medical expenses were rarely covered. If you were injured, you were expected to pay for your own doctor, your own surgery, your own rehabilitation. For a man making $100 a game, a hospital bill could represent a year's savings. So they avoided doctors. They leaned on the team's trainer with his tape and iodine. They played with injuries that today would mandate immediate surgery and months of rehab. Hernias, torn cartilage, fractures that healed crooked. These were the secret ledgers of their careers. hidden from public view but paid for every day for the rest of their lives. The Depression's grip was not just about empty bank accounts. It was about the colonization of a man's spirit. It replaced courage with desperation and sacrifice with necessity. It convinced a generation of athletes that the degradation of their bodies was a fair trade for a few dollars and the fleeting illusion of security. The field became an escape from poverty, but at the cost of entering a different kind of prison. They were not gladiators seeking glory. They were laborers locked in a brutal industry, knowing the machine could break them at any moment, and knowing with even greater certainty that society offered no refuge if it did. And waiting for them on the sideline, the only figure who could offer any respite from this grinding calculus was a man with a black bag. He couldn't cure their poverty, but he could make them forget their pain, if only for a few quarters. He was the gatekeeper to continued performance, and his methods would become another kind of tragedy. The modern sideline is a monument to medical technology, a field of blue tents hiding concussion protocols, tablets displaying real-time injury analytics, athletic trainers with degrees in biomechanics, team surgeons specializing in orthopedics. It is a fortress of science built around the vulnerable athlete. Now strip all of that away. Erase the tents, the tablets, the degrees. What you are left with is the sideline of the 1930s. A few wooden benches, a bucket of water, a lone figure, often in street clothes, carrying a small, worn black bag. This was the medical staff. This was the frontier between a broken body and the expectation to continue. In an era defined by the absence of safety protocols, the most profound absence was that of professional medicine. The man with the black bag was not a savior. He was a mechanic, and his job was not to heal, but to get damaged machinery back onto the assembly line by any means necessary. His tools were ignorance, superstition, and a burgeoning arsenal of chemicals that would leave scars deeper than any cleat mark. First, we must identify the document. The title was often a courtesy, not a credential. On some teams, it was indeed a local physician, a general practitioner who volunteered or was paid a small fee for weekend duty. His knowledge was broad, not specialized. A broken bone he could set, a cut he could suture. But the subtler internal injuries, the soft tissue damage, the neurology of head trauma, this was alien territory. His primary allegiance was to the team owner who paid him, creating an immediate, fundamental conflict of interest. His patient was the franchise's winning percentage, not the long-term health of the young man before him. On other teams, particularly the less stable ones, the doc was not a doctor at all. He was the trainer, a former player, a masseur, a self-taught enthusiast with no formal medical education. His expertise was born of anecdote and locker room lore. He was a practitioner of folk remedies, a witch doctor for the age of industrial sport. His black bag contained a pharmacopoeia of the bizarre and the brutal. The most iconic tool was the ammonia inhalant, the smelling salts. A small glass capsule crushed under the nose of an unconscious or dazed player. The violent, caustic fumes would trigger a gasping reflex, shocking the central nervous system into alertness. It did nothing to address the brain injury that caused the unconsciousness. It merely rebooted the system, forcing a concussed mind back into a state of full coherence. The player would stagger to his feet, eyes watering, head pounding, and be declared ready. It was the perfect symbol of the era's medicine, treating the most visible symptom while ignoring the catastrophic cause. For pain, the solutions were equally crude. Whiskey was a standard sideline stimulant and analgesic, a quick swig from a flask for courage and numbness. For musculoskeletal pain, the treatment was counter-irritation. They would rub powerful, burning liniments into sore muscles or joints. The theory was that creating a new, superficial pain, a chemical burn on the skin, would distract from the deeper, more serious injury. It was a placebo with side effects. For cuts, iodine was poured directly into wounds, a searing antiseptic that felt like being branded. And then there was the most infamous mantra, rub some dirt on it. This was not a metaphor. For abrasions, for minor bleeding, actual dirt from the field was sometimes packed into the wound to clot the blood, guaranteeing a severe infection later. Hygiene was an afterthought. Needles for injections were reused, simply wiped on a towel. Tape was torn by hand and teeth. But the most significant, most fateful development to emerge from this medical dark age was the birth of the locker room injection culture. As the decade progressed, the black bag began to include more powerful pharmaceuticals. Primitive steroids like testosterone extracts were experimented with to build mass and accelerate recovery, with no understanding of the endocrine havoc they wreaked. More commonly and more insidiously were the pain-killing injections. Procaine, a local anesthetic, and later the more powerful morphine derivatives. This was the game changer. A doctor or trainer could now, with a syringe, erase pain at its source. A shot in the knee could make a torn ligament feel stable. A shot in the shoulder could allow a separated joint to bear weight. The player, numbed, could return to the field. This was sold as a medical miracle. In reality, it was a Faustian bargain. The injection did not heal. It masked. It turned off the body's primary alarm system, pain, allowing a player to inflict catastrophic, permanent damage on an already injured body part. A meniscus tear became a shredded knee. A minor fracture became a compound break. The player, feeling nothing, would rely on the limb, destroy it, and only confront the true extent of the injury days later when the anesthetic wore off, often in the form of a surgical emergency. Furthermore, these injections were administered in filthy locker rooms, by hands that were not sterile, leading to rampant abscesses and blood infections. The practice created a psychological dependency as well. It taught a generation of players that serious injury was not a reason to stop, but a problem to be chemically solved. It embedded the idea that the body's warnings were irrelevant, that pain was an obstacle to be medically demolished, not a signal to be obeyed. The man with the black bag stood at the crossroads of ignorance and necessity. He was the enabler of the carnage, the one who made the unsustainable seem sustainable for one more quarter, one more game. His methods were a form of alchemy, turning broken flesh into temporary currency. But the debt always came due. And for the most profound, most hidden injuries, the ones inside the sealed vault of the skull, his bag had no tools, no answers, not even a flawed one. For the repeated, untreated concussions that were a staple of every Sunday, the medical establishment of the 1930s football world had only a shrug and a devastating misdiagnosis. A simple case of being punch drunk. In the modern lexicon of football, the word concussion carries immense weight. It is a clinical term, a diagnosis that triggers a mandatory protocol, a source of lawsuits and existential dread for the league. In the 1930s, that word had no place on the football field. It belonged in medical textbooks discussing railway accidents or mining disasters, not in sports. The vocabulary that did exist for head trauma was tellingly casual, a collection of euphemisms that softened and sanitized the violent disruption of the brain. You didn't suffer a concussion. You got your bell rung. You were dinged. You were shook up. The language was auditory, trivializing. A bell rings, it echoes, and then it settles. A ding is a minor dent. Being shook up is a temporary state of disarray. This was not just slang. It was a conceptual framework, and it was catastrophically wrong. It framed a traumatic brain injury as a fleeting event, a temporary malfunction of consciousness that could be reset with a deep breath and a display of grit. The total, systemic ignorance of head trauma in the 1930s NFL is perhaps the single most consequential failure of the era, a failure that would sow seeds of neurological ruin for generations of men. The sideline protocol for a player who lay motionless or stumbled with glassy eyes was a ritual of absurd simplicity. The ammonia capsule was the first step, the chemical jolt. Then came the diagnostic test. A coach, trainer, or doctor would stand over the player and hold up a certain number of fingers. How many? The player, fighting through fog, nausea, and double vision, would have to answer correctly. If he could, he was deemed fit. It was a test of basic cognitive function mistaken for a test of brain integrity. It assessed nothing of memory, balance, emotional regulation, or processing speed. It was a carnival trick. Pass the finger test and you were cleared. The message was unequivocal. Your brain is fine. Your will is now in question. To refuse to return was to fail the test of manhood, not the test of medicine. This ding protocol was the entirety of the concussion policy. There were no spotters in the booth, no blue medical tents, no independent neurologists. The decision rested with the very men whose success depended on that player's immediate return. This ignorance was reinforced, not challenged, by the medical literature of the day. While early 20th century psychiatry was familiar with traumatic neuroses from war, and boxing writers spoke of punch-drunk fighters, the connection to football was rarely made in academic circles. When it was often dismissed. The prevailing view of the brain was mechanical and simplistic. It was seen as a stable, durable organ floating in fluid. A jarring blow might cause a short circuit, a commotion, or a concussion, but it was believed the brain would naturally and completely return to its original state once the shaking stopped. The concept of cumulative damage was alien. The idea that dozens or hundreds of subconcussive hits, the kind endured on every play by linemen, could cause progressive degeneration was unthinkable. Doctors simply did not look for it. A player exhibiting strange behavior, depression, or cognitive decline years after his career was seen as having a personal problem, not a football-related illness. The science had not yet provided the vocabulary, so the suffering remained nameless, and therefore without cause. The stories from the field, viewed through our modern understanding, are chillingly clear records of catastrophic neurological events. They were witnessed by thousands, reported in newspapers, and utterly misunderstood. In 1937, Detroit Lions quarterback Dutch Clark, one of the game's biggest stars, took a ferocious hit and collapsed. He was revived, insisted on staying in, and played the remainder of the game. Teammates reported that for the rest of the quarter, he called plays that didn't exist, argued with imaginary opponents, and had no memory of the game's final sequences when it was over. This was reported as an anecdote of his toughness, not a case study of severe disorientation and amnesia. In a 1935 game between the Giants and Bears, a lineman was knocked out cold. He was dragged to the sideline, revived, and sent back in. On the very next series, he collapsed again, this time suffering a grand mal seizure on the field. He was carried off, and the game continued after a brief delay. The next day's papers noted the frightening incident, but focused on the team's bravery in overcoming the distraction. The player's future health was not a subject of follow-up. The most tragic figures are those for whom the damage was not episodic, but permanent and immediately obvious. Men who left the field as different people. There are accounts of players who, after a particular hit, became childlike, docile, and confused, unable to dress themselves or find their way home. They were often described as having nervous exhaustion or being shell-shocked, a term borrowed from the trenches of World War I. Their careers were, of course, over, but their treatment ended there. They were not referred to specialists. They were not studied. They were sent home to their families as broken men. Their condition a mysterious, private tragedy. The league bore no responsibility because medically, legally, and culturally, no link had been established between the violence of the game and the destruction of a mind. The absence of knowledge became the ultimate shield for the institution. This created a legacy of silent suffering. Men who retired and found their tempers shortening, their memories failing, their personalities coarsening. They attributed it to aging, to hard living, to bad luck. They could not attribute it to the hundreds of times they got their bell rung for $100 a week. The ignorance was so complete that it prevented even the victims from understanding their own plight. They had been taught that walking off a dinger was a sign of strength. They never learned that they might be walking away with a time bomb in their heads. This fundamental, willful blindness to the brain's fragility is the dark heart of the 1930s story. And from this fertile ground of unseen injury grew the league's most potent and destructive myth. The legend of the Iron Man, the player whose body and mind could withstand endless punishment, whose very durability was proof of his superiority, and whose example would be used to shame every future generation of players into silence. The mythology of any sport requires its heroes, and in the brutal, unvarnished world of 1930s football, a specific archetype was forged and celebrated above all others: the Iron Man. This was not merely a durable player. This was a superhuman ideal. The man who never left the field. The 60-minute man. The player who lined up on offense, defense, and special teams, play after play, week after week, season after season, without relief, without complaint, and seemingly without breaking. In a league where the physical toll was so horrific that attrition was the norm, the Iron Man stood as a rebuke to human limitation. He was living proof that the game's demands could not only be met but mastered through sheer force of will. But this was more than just a sporting accolade. The cult of the Iron Man was a carefully constructed narrative, a propaganda tool essential to the league's survival and growth. It served to glorify suffering, to normalize the extraordinary, and to place the ultimate burden of proof not on the safety of the sport, but on the toughness of the individual. It was a myth that sold tickets, inspired boys, and broke men. The primary architects of this myth were not the coaches or the owners, but the sports writers. In the golden age of newspaper dominance, writers like Grantland Rice, Damon Runyon, and Westbrook Pegler held immense power to shape public perception. They were the poets of the playing field, and they found their greatest muse in the Iron Man Rice. In particular, with his flowing romantic prose, transformed gritty athletes into timeless legends. He didn't write about a player's technique. He wrote about his spirit. A narrative took hold. The true measure of a football player was not in his statistics, but in his stamina. A narrative took hold. The true measure of a football player was not in his statistics, but in his stamina. Headlines celebrated the indestructible player's name. Articles marveled at men who played with broken hands, cracked ribs, or severe sprains, framing these acts not as medical emergencies, but as epic feats of courage. The language was lifted from epic poetry and battlefield dispatches. These men were warriors, gladiators, Spartans. By wrapping the reality of constant pain in the cloak of heroism, the press performed an alchemy that turned exploitation into admiration. They made the public complicit in the demand for inhuman durability. This manufactured ideal created an invisible psychological prison for every player on the roster. The Iron Man set the standard. If he could play every minute with a separated shoulder, what did it say about you if you came out with a twisted ankle? The pressure was immense and internalized. To ask for a rest, to acknowledge a need for relief, was to confess a fundamental weakness. It was to mark yourself as less than a teammate, less than a professional, less than a man. This dynamic fostered a culture of secrecy and deception. Players became adept at hiding injuries, at disguising limps, at shrugging off hits that left them seeing stars. The training room was not a sanctuary for healing. It was a place you avoided, lest you be labeled soft or damaged goods. The fear was not just of losing your position, but of losing your identity within the brotherhood. You were defined by your ability to absorb punishment, and to admit you were hurt was to erase yourself. To understand the full cost of this myth, we must look at a specific case to move from the archetype to the human being. The quintessential Iron Man of the 1930s was Mel Hein, the center and linebacker for the New York Giants. Hein's streak was the stuff of legend. From 1931 through the 1941 season, he did not miss a single minute of a single game. He played both ways, the pivotal snapper on offense and the defensive signal caller, the brain and the brawn of his team for over a decade of relentless combat. Sports writers called him Old Indestructible. He was the living embodiment of the ideal, a player so tough, so reliable, he seemed carved from granite. His durability was the foundation of the Giants' success and a cornerstone of the NFL's marketing. He was proof that the game could be survived. But what did survival look like? The myth ended with the final whistle of each game. The reality continued. Hein played through concussions, through broken bones, through injuries that would have hospitalized a civilian. He later admitted, in a rare moment of candor, that he often couldn't remember large portions of games, playing on instinct and adrenaline through a fog of pain. The true legacy of his Iron Man streak was written in the decades that followed. The price was paid in a body that aged with profound suffering. But more telling than his physical ailments was the psychological toll observed by those closest to him. His son, Mel Hein Jr., would later speak of the man who came home from football. He described a father who was often withdrawn, irritable, prone to sudden, unexplained anger. He lived with chronic, debilitating headaches. The vibrant, focused leader on the field could become a distant, frustrated figure at home, struggling with a temper he could not always control. The very qualities that made him an indestructible icon on Sunday, the suppression of pain, the denial of weakness, the compartmentalization of trauma, became ghosts that haunted his private life. The Iron Man had been forged in the furnace of the NFL, but the process left cracks in the foundation of the man. He was celebrated for what he withstood, but no one, not even Hein himself, could fully account for what it cost him to do so. The myth of the Iron Man was a double-edged sword. It gave the league its first true heroes, men whose names resonated beyond the sports page. But it also established a dangerous contract. It told the audience that the spectacle was safe because Superman existed within it. It told ownership that players could and should be used without limit. And most damagingly, it told the players that their greatest worth was their expendability. If you broke, the fault was not with the game's demands, but with your own constitution. You had failed to live up to the standard of the Iron Men. This mythos provided the moral cover for the league's refusal to address safety, to expand rosters, to provide relief. Why change a game that produced such magnificent, enduring heroes? The answer, of course, was that the heroes weren't enduring. They were eroding from the inside out. And as the sports writers penned their odes to these titans, they were utterly blind to the environment that made such feats not just possible, but necessary. The primitive, often horrific playing surfaces of the era, where mud, blood, and frozen earth became literal arenas of torture, testing the Iron Man myth against the unyielding laws of physics and flesh. The modern football field is a sterile, controlled environment. Its grass is a hybrid cultivar, its drainage system a marvel of hydrology, its subsurface a carefully engineered matrix of sand and gravel. It is designed to be consistent, to be safe, to be predictable. To step onto a professional gridiron in the 1930s was to surrender any expectation of consistency or safety. The field itself was the third opponent, a capricious and often malicious force that could maim as surely as any opponent's helmet. The conditions were not a variable to be managed. They were an elemental trial to be endured. The game was played on whatever patch of earth the home team could secure, often a baseball diamond in the off-season, a public park, or a makeshift stadium with poor drainage. The result was a trifecta of terrains, each uniquely dangerous. The quagmire of mud, the concrete-like frozen turf, and the sun-baked, rock-hard dirt. These were not mere backdrops. They were active participants in the carnage, multiplying the risks of an already lethal sport and exposing the league's profound indifference to the basic welfare of its workforce. Mud was the most common and, in its own way, the most sinister. Without proper drainage, a single day of rain could transform a field into a viscous bog. The game would proceed, the players slogging through ankle-deep muck that sucked at their cleats. The beautiful, intricate plays of strategy dissolved into a primitive, low-speed wrestling match in the sludge. But the danger was not in the slowing down. It was in the anchoring. A player's foot, planted to make a cut or brace for a hit, would sink and become stuck. With the foot locked in the grip of the earth, the body would continue to rotate from a tackle, leading to grotesque, catastrophic knee and ankle injuries, ligaments torn, bones shattered. Furthermore, the mud was rarely just dirt and water. It was filth. It was soaked with horse manure from pre-game parades, with litter, with bacteria. Every open wound, every skinned knee, every gash from a cleat was packed with this septic paste. Infections were rampant. A simple cut could lead to a staph infection, blood poisoning, or gangrene. Men played with fever from infected wounds, their bodies fighting internal battles while they waged external ones. The mud also hid dangers. A divot from a previous play, now filled with water, could be a foot trap. The uniform, once a sleek wool layer, became a heavy, waterlogged shroud that weighed dozens of pounds, exhausting the player and making him a slower, more vulnerable target. If mud was a slow, sucking peril, frozen turf was instant, shattering punishment. Late-season games in Chicago, Green Bay, or New York were often played on fields that were, for all intents and purposes, slabs of concrete covered with a thin, brittle layer of dead grass. The ground did not give. When a body hit it, the force was transferred directly into bones and joints. The sound of a tackle on frozen ground was different, a sharper, more final crack. Concussions were far more frequent and severe because the skull had nowhere to dissipate the energy. It met an unyielding surface. Players learned to fall in specific, controlled ways to avoid breaking hips or shoulders, a skill as crucial as blocking or tackling. Fingers and toes suffered frostbite. The brittle leather of helmets and pads would harden, offering even less protection. The football itself became a rock-like object, difficult to catch and painful to be hit with. Games on frozen fields were exercises in pure, unadulterated impact, where the primary strategy was to inflict more pain on your opponent than you could absorb yourself. It was gladiatorial combat on a surface designed to break things. Then there was the opposite extreme, the sun-baked, rock-hard dirt of early-season games in places like Boston or Philadelphia, where fields were little more than compacted earth. These surfaces were unforgiving in a different way. They were abrasive, tearing skin on impact. A slide could mean losing several layers of flesh. The hardpan was also uneven, riddled with minor ruts and holes that could twist an ankle or buckle a knee during a full-speed sprint. There was no give, no cushion. Every step sent a shock up the legs. The dust kicked up by play would coat the players' throats and lungs, mixing with sweat to form a grimy paste in their eyes and mouths. Dehydration was a constant threat, compounded by the fact that players were actively discouraged from drinking water during games, as it was thought to cause cramping. The league's stance on these conditions was one of pure, pragmatic indifference. Improving fields cost money. Money for drainage, for sod, for irrigation, for full-time groundskeepers. In a decade where franchises were barely surviving, such expenditures were seen as frivolous. The field was a fixed cost, and player safety was not a line item on the balance sheet. In fact, there was a perverse argument that the brutal conditions added to the spectacle. They were proof of the sport's rugged, masculine authenticity. Sports writers would revel in descriptions of mud-caked warriors, of blood freezing on jerseys in the icy cold, portraying it as a testament to character rather than a failure of infrastructure. The 1935 NFL championship game, played in Detroit on a frozen field so hard that officials used a pickaxe to try and chip holes for the yard markers, was legendary not for its atrocity, but for its epic toughness. The league and its promoters had no incentive to change. The very horror of the environment sold tickets and built mythology. It provided the perfect, uncomplaining scapegoat for injury. A man didn't blow out his knee because of a dangerous cut. He blew it out because of a bad spot on the field. It was an act of God, not a failure of the employer to provide a safe workplace. I'd break him more quickly, that was a cost of doing business. The mud, the ice, the hardpan, they were all collaborators in a system designed for attrition. And if a player managed to survive these elemental trials, he then had to contend with another layer of sanctioned violence, one governed not by nature, but by the men in striped shirts whose whistles remained silent in the face of brutality. The rules of engagement, or the lack thereof, would become the final arbiter of how much punishment a human body could be expected to bear. The rules of a sport are not just a framework for competition. They are a statement of values. They define what is acceptable, what is penalized, and ultimately what the game believes itself to be. In the modern NFL, the rulebook is a sprawling, constantly amended document obsessed with protecting players, particularly from certain types of hits. It is a reflection, however imperfect, of an understanding that the human body has limits that must be respected by the law of the game. In the 1930s, the rulebook was a thin, simple pamphlet, and its primary value was not protection but promotion. The officials on the field were not just arbiters. They were curators of violence. Their unspoken mandate, passed down from league officials and team owners desperate for the sport to capture the public's imagination, was clear. Let them play. This directive was a euphemism. It meant swallow the whistle. It meant ignore the aftermath. It meant allow the spectacle of collision to proceed, uninterrupted by concerns of safety or sportsmanship. In this environment, the whistle didn't blow for offenses that would today draw suspensions and fines. It didn't blow because the violence was the product, and the men in stripes were its quality control, ensuring nothing impeded its delivery. The philosophy was rooted in a deliberate, calculated image building. Professional football was the rough-hewn cousin to the more established college game. To distinguish itself, to attract paying customers, it leaned into its perceived brutality. It would be grittier, tougher, more mercenary. The officials were essential to this branding. They were instructed, both formally and through cultural osmosis, to call a loose game. Fouls were for egregious, fight-starting infractions, not for the routine carnage of the line of scrimmage or the secondary. Throwing a flag was seen as interrupting the flow, as being soft. This created a Wild West atmosphere where players quickly learned the boundaries were not where the rulebook said they were, but where an official's personal tolerance for mayhem ended. And that tolerance was exceedingly high. Consider the arsenal of legal violence. The clothesline tackle, where a defender would extend a stiff arm directly into a ball carrier's throat or head, using his forearm as a bar to clothesline him to the ground, was a standard, celebrated technique. Head slapping, particularly by defensive linemen, was a relentless tactic used to disorient offensive linemen. A series of open palm blows to the helmetless head that would now be flagged as unnecessary roughness. The crackback block, as discussed, was legal and devastating. But beyond specific techniques, it was the consistent, sanctioned practice of late hits. There was no defenseless player protection. A receiver who had just caught a ball could be launched into while airborne, hit well after the ball had arrived, or driven into the ground well after the play was over. The whistle was slow to come. Gang tackling regularly evolved into pile driving, where defenders would continue to jump on and drive into a ball carrier long after his forward progress was stopped, with the explicit goal of injuring and intimidating. Player testimonies from the era are filled with stories of hits that were not just violent but predatory, and which drew no penalty. They speak of bounty games, where specific star players were targeted for removal. Ace Parker, a star halfback for the Brooklyn Dodgers, recalled a game where a linebacker told him in the pile, "We're getting $50 from the kitty if you don't finish this game." He was subjected to constant, late, high hits whenever he touched the ball. No flags were thrown. The message was clear. This was part of the professional bargain. More tragically, there are accounts of career-ending plays that were utterly unflagged. A promising rookie receiver, cutting across the middle, would be met by a safety who left his feet and led with his helmet, directly crushing the receiver's chest or head. The player would be carried off, his career over, and the game would continue without so much as a 15-yard penalty. The hit was clean within the era's permissive code. It was just good, hard football. This officiating culture placed an impossible burden on the players. With no reliable protection from the rules, they had to become their own enforcers. Retaliation was the only true deterrent. If an opponent took a cheap shot, your lineman would be expected to retaliate on the next play, often with a low block or a late hit of their own. This created a cyclical, escalating economy of violence that officials would deliberately let burn. Fights were common, but they were also part of the show. The referee's role was not to prevent them, but to manage them, to step in only when they threatened to stop the game entirely. The player was thus trapped in a dual role, athlete and vigilante. His safety depended not on the impartial application of rules, but on his own reputation for retaliation and the fear it instilled. The consequence of this system was the normalization of the catastrophic. When a vicious, career-ending hit draws no penalty, it sends a powerful message to everyone watching. Asterisk, this is acceptable. This is football. Asterisk, it recalibrates the entire moral compass of the sport. The players adjust their expectations downward. The fans come to see such hits as highlights, not as tragedies. The league points to the lack of a flag as proof that no rules were broken, deflecting any ethical responsibility. The officiating, therefore, was not a failure of enforcement. It was a successful enforcement of a different, unspoken set of rules. Rules designed to maximize drama and minimize interruption, regardless of the human cost. This sanctioned lawlessness on the field could not exist in a vacuum. It needed a public relations arm, a way to translate the chaos into a compelling narrative for the masses. The raw, unpenalized violence witnessed by the few thousand in the stadium had to be packaged and sold to the millions reading newspapers and listening to radios. It required a chorus of voices not just to describe the carnage, but to justify it, to poeticize it, to weave it into the national fabric. That task fell to the men in the press box, the mythmakers with typewriters who would transform the Sunday slaughter into the stuff of legend, ensuring that the public saw heroes where there were only casualties, and glory where there was only pain. The roar of the crowd was real. The crack of the collision was real. The blood in the mud was real. But for the vast majority of Americans who did not witness games in person, professional football in the 1930s was not an experience of raw sensation. It was a story, and that story was written, edited, and narrated by a nascent media machine that had a profound stake in the league's success. The images captured by newsreel cameras, the words flowing from radio announcers' microphones, and the headlines in newspapers were not neutral reports. They were acts of creation. They took the chaotic, often horrific reality of the Sunday slaughterhouse and transformed it into a consumable product of heroism, excitement, and thrilling danger. This media ecosystem did not merely report on the NFL. It actively constructed its mythology, sanitizing its violence, glorifying its suffering, and embedding it into the national consciousness as a noble, masculine pursuit. The newsreels, in a very real sense, lied. And those lies were essential to the league's survival. Consider the dominant visual medium of the day, the theatrical newsreel. Shown in movie palaces before the feature film, these 10-minute reels were America's window on the world. Their coverage of sports was never journalism. It was spectacle. The narration was bombastic, delivered in a triumphant baritone over stirring orchestral music. The editing was rapid and dramatic. When covering football, the newsreels focused on a few key elements: long, thrilling runs, dramatic leaps for passes, and most importantly, the big hit. But the hit was always clean, always spectacular, never medical. A player would be leveled, the camera would hold for a second on the aftermath, and then it would cut immediately to the victorious defender celebrating or the ball carrier bravely rising to his feet. The sequence was designed to elicit a gasp, then a cheer. The narration would declare, "A crushing tackle by the formidable Bronski." There was no follow-up. No shot of the player struggling to focus on the sideline, no mention of a concussion, no interview with a doctor. The violence was a punctuation mark, exciting and finite. It had no consequence. The newsreel presented a world where men collided with incredible force and simply bounced back, ready for the next play. It was a cartoon of human durability. Radio broadcasters, painting pictures with sound, engaged in their own brand of poetic license. With only their voices to convey the action, they leaned heavily on metaphor and melodrama. A vicious hit was not a potential neurological event. It was a thunderous shot, a devastating blow, a tackle that shook the very stadium. A player staying in the game after being injured was gallant, courageous, a warrior refusing to leave his post. The language was borrowed from Homeric epic and wartime propaganda. Legendary announcer Graham McNamee didn't just describe a game. He narrated a chivalric romance. In his cadence, the players were knights, the field was a lists, and pain was a test of honor. This framing was incredibly powerful. It conditioned listeners to interpret suffering as virtue. It taught them that a player being carried off was a tragic hero, not a broken employee. The broadcaster's excited tone during a violent play was a cue for the audience. This is what you should be excited about. This is the thrill you paid for. The newspaper sports writers, as we've touched on, were the chief architects of the Iron Man myth, but their complicity ran deeper. They were not observers on the outside. They were embedded within the culture of the game. They traveled with the teams, shared trains and hotels, depended on access to coaches and players for their livelihoods. This created a powerful incentive to write favorably, to protect the sport that fed them. Catastrophic injury was often framed as a dramatic plot point in a season's narrative. A 1934 article on a player who suffered a compound fracture described him as contributing his bone and blood to the team's gritty victory, transforming a horrifying medical emergency into a symbol of sacrifice. Stories of players receiving pain-killing injections were written as tales of medical ingenuity and personal dedication, not as alarming breaches of ethics. The press acted as a filter, straining out the troubling questions of safety and long-term cost, leaving only the sediment of inspiration and excitement. Yet, amidst this chorus of glorification, there were rare, dissenting voices, journalists who peered behind the myth and were unsettled by what they saw. Their reports were not celebrated. They were anomalies, often published in literary magazines or the columns of iconoclasts. One of the most striking was a piece by journalist John R. Tunis, who wrote for Harper's Magazine and The New Yorker. After observing the 1935 season, he penned a scathing critique titled "The Great God Football." He described the players not as heroes, but as overgrown gladiators, their faces masks of pain and exhaustion. He focused on the aftermath. The limping walks to the locker room, the vacant stares, the whispered conversations about who wouldn't be back next week. He questioned the very morality of a spectacle that demanded such physical sacrifice for entertainment. "We pay to see men risk their futures," he wrote, "and call it sport." Another writer, Westbrook Pegler, despite often being a traditionalist, occasionally let his cynicism show. In a column about the relentless violence, he quipped, "The rules seem to be written on the assumption that the human body is made of rubber and the brain of scrambled eggs." These voices were lonely. They were dismissed as sentimental or unmanly. They did not change the narrative, but they left a crucial, honest record. A crack in the facade that proves some people saw the truth clearly. Even then, the complicity of the media was not a conspiracy. It was a convergence of interests. The league needed promotion to grow. The media needed exciting content to sell papers, airtime, and movie tickets. Together, they crafted a compelling fiction. That professional football was a realm of pure, righteous struggle, where pain was temporary and glory was eternal. This fiction served to anesthetize the public conscience. It made it possible for fans to cheer for violence without contemplating its cost. It allowed parents to let their sons idolize players without fearing for their well-being. It built the cultural foundation upon which the NFL's empire would be erected. But for the players, the cheering was fleeting. The newsreels ended. The radio dial was turned. The newspaper was used to wrap fish. They were left with the unedited reality of their broken bodies, and a future that the glorious narratives never covered. A life of quiet obscurity, mounting bills, and fading relevance, where the only reminder of their sacrifice was the pain that followed them into a world that had already forgotten their names. The final whistle of a career in the 1930s NFL did not mark a transition. It marked an end. There was no ceremony, no gold watch, no press conference. One week you were a player, the next week you were a former player. And in that moment, the league's interest in you ceased absolutely. The contract you signed was explicit. You were paid for your services on game day. Nothing more. There was no pension plan, no healthcare continuation, no disability insurance, no off-season pay, no transition program. You were a seasonal laborer whose season had ended permanently. The relationship was transactional, and the transaction was complete. What followed was not a retirement, but an exile. An exile into a world that had little use for men whose primary skills were absorbing punishment and inflicting it, whose bodies were often broken, and whose fame was fleeting and local. This is the story of the aftermath, a life lived in secondhand clothes, where the glory of Sunday afternoons faded into the quiet desperation of Monday mornings for the rest of their lives. The financial cliff was immediate and steep. A player's last paycheck might have to last him until he found work, which in the Depression was no guarantee. For stars, there might be brief opportunities, a low-level coaching job, a speaking engagement, a minor endorsement. But for the vast majority, the options were grim and physically demanding. These were men in their late 20s or early 30s, often with no college degree, their bodies already bearing the wear of a decade of combat. They returned to the manual labor they had hoped football would help them escape. They became factory workers, construction laborers, truck drivers, bartenders, security guards. The irony was cruel. Jobs that required physical strength were now torturous for bodies riddled with arthritis, old fractures, and chronic pain. Johnny "Blood" McNally, the charismatic Packers Hall of Famer, drifted through a series of odd jobs after football. From selling magazines to manual labor, his brilliant, erratic mind never finding a stable purchase in the civilian world. His story was not unique in its instability, only in its flair. Even the most celebrated legends were not spared. Consider the case of Duke Slater, a pioneering African-American tackle for the Chicago Cardinals, and a player of immense skill and respect. After his retirement in 1931, he became a lawyer and later a judge. A rare success story. Yet, he lived with constant pain from football injuries until his death at age 67. For every Slater, there were many more like Tony Latwin, a star fullback for the Pottsville Maroons and Providence Steamroller. After football, he worked in a steel mill, his powerful legs now stiff and aching from years of carries on rock-hard fields. He died in relative obscurity, his name lost to all but the most dedicated historians. These men did not fade away. They were erased by a system that took everything they had to give and offered nothing in return for the future. The league's official stance was one of cold, legalistic detachment. The attitude of ownership was crystallized in a phrase often attributed to the era's moguls. You were paid for your time. Any lingering effects were your problem, your bad luck, the consequence of a risk you voluntarily undertook. There was no moral or ethical concept of post-career responsibility. The player had been an asset. Once that asset could no longer produce on the field, it was depreciated to zero and written off the books. This philosophy was codified in the standard player contract, which included waivers of liability and contained no post-career considerations whatsoever. The idea that the league owed these men for the physical capital they expended to build the sport's popularity was not just rejected. It was incomprehensible. The game was a business, not a family. Ultis. Children grew up with fathers who were sometimes distant, irritable ghosts. Men who winced when they rose from a chair, who couldn't play catch, who had headaches that required silence in the house for days. The personality changes associated with unaddressed head trauma. The depression, the rages, the forgetfulness, were borne by families who had no vocabulary for what was happening. They didn't see CTE. They saw a man becoming someone they didn't recognize, and they blamed themselves or him, never the game that had silently rewired his brain years before. There was also the quiet shame of downward mobility. A man who had been written about in newspapers, who had heard the cheers of crowds, might now be struggling to pay the electric bill or humiliated by his inability to perform simple physical tasks. This loss of status, this disconnect between past glory and present struggle, was a profound psychological injury layered atop the physical ones. Families learned not to talk about his football days, not because they weren't proud, but because the contrast between the photograph in the uniform and the reality of the man at the kitchen table was too painful. The memorabilia, the old helmet, the yellowed clippings, were packed away in attics, relics of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. This post-career oblivion was the final, definitive proof of the league's exploitative nature. It revealed the entire enterprise as a brutal, short-term exchange. The NFL took the best years of a man's physical life, the very integrity of his body and mind, and in return gave him a pittance that ended the moment his usefulness did. It created a human surplus of broken men and then looked away. The field had been a site of controlled violence, but the aftermath was an uncontrolled, quiet suffering that stretched for decades. The league moved on, promoting new heroes, new myths. The men who built the foundation were left to navigate the ruins of their own health, supported only by families who absorbed the collateral damage. And for too many, the final chapter of this oblivion was not just poverty or pain, but a premature and often ignoble death, the direct line from the playing fields of the 1930s to the graveyards of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, where the true cost was buried, unmarked, and unclaimed. The statistics of the early NFL are filled with numbers. Yards gained, games won, points scored. But there is another, more somber ledger that was never officially kept. It records the ultimate price, the final transaction in the brutal economy of 1930s football. These are the stories of men who did not just have their careers shortened, but their lives. Their deaths, often premature and always violent or painful, are the period at the end of the sentence that began with their first professional snap. They died on the field by their own hand, from neglected wounds, or in baffling accidents. In each case, the thread leads back to the game, to the culture of neglect, and to a medical understanding that was not just inadequate but dangerously blind. These are the forgotten deaths. They were reported as individual tragedies, freak occurrences, or personal failings. They were never connected, never seen as what they were: symptoms of a systemic disease. The most direct deaths were those that happened on the field, in front of spectators. While rare, they occurred with a shocking matter-of-factness. Joe Donahue's cerebral hemorrhage in 1934, dying hours after a game, was one. But there were others. In 1931, J.V. Solly Solomon, a tackle for the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, collapsed and died of a heart attack during a game in New York. He was 27. The official cause was listed as a pre-existing condition, a bad heart. No autopsy was performed to investigate the potential role of physical trauma or stimulants. The game, after a delay, continued. The newspapers treated it as a shocking but isolated incident, a grim reminder of life's fragility. There was no investigation by the league into whether the intensity of play or the conditions could have been a factor. His death was an act of God, not a potential outcome of the sport's design. The show had to go on, and it did, teaching a terrible lesson. Even death would not stop the machinery. Then there are the deaths that came later, shrouded in more mystery but bearing the haunting markers of neurological catastrophe. Suicide is the most chilling category. The story of John Bull Carsis, a punishing fullback for the Pittsburgh Pirates and Philadelphia Eagles in the late 1930s, is a case study. Carsis was known for his ferocious, head-down running style. He absorbed and delivered tremendous punishment. After his career ended in 1940, he struggled. He drifted through jobs, his personality growing increasingly volatile and dark. In 1949, at the age of 37, he died by suicide. The obituary spoke of despondency and personal problems. There was no mention of football, of the hundreds of head impacts, of the possibility that the very instrument of his on-field success, his willingness to use his head as a battering ram, might have eroded the brain that governed his moods and impulses. His death was a private tragedy, severed from his public life as a gladiator. Other deaths were slow, gruesome, and born of the era's medical ignorance. Infections from untreated game wounds were a silent killer. A deeply infected cut or a case of blood poisoning from a dirty needle used for a pain-killing injection could be fatal in the age before widespread antibiotics. Players would attempt to play through significant lacerations or abscesses, believing it was a sign of toughness, only to succumb to sepsis days or weeks later. These deaths would occur at home, away from the stadium, and were rarely connected to football in any public record. They were attributed to pneumonia, blood infection, or kidney failure. The originating event, the dirty wound on a muddy field, the unsterile injection in a dank locker room, was lost to history. The player simply died after a short illness, his football career a non-factor in his obituary. A more ambiguous but telling category involves accidents that may have been precipitated by post-concussion syndrome or cognitive decline. There are accounts of former players in the 1940s and 1950s dying in car crashes under strange circumstances, veering into oncoming traffic for no apparent reason, failing to navigate simple turns. At the time, these were attributed to recklessness or alcohol, but through a modern lens, they raise terrible questions. Could undiagnosed brain trauma have impaired their judgment, blurred their vision, or slowed their reaction times at a fatal moment? A player who spent a career being dinged might have lived with degraded spatial awareness and processing speed, turning an ordinary drive into a death trap. These connections were impossible to make then. The accident was the cause, full stop. The idea that the seed of the accident was planted a decade earlier on a football field was beyond medical or cultural comprehension. The reporting of these deaths consistently avoided systemic blame. The language was one of pity and fate. A tragic end to a promising life. A victim of cruel circumstance. A brave athlete succumbed after a valiant fight. This framing served a crucial purpose. It insulated the game. If Carsis's suicide was a personal demon, then the NFL bore no responsibility. If a player died of an infection, it was a freak medical complication, not a consequence of medieval sideline hygiene. If a man died on the field, it was a heart ailment, not a question of whether the physical demands of professional football could overwhelm a young man's cardiovascular system. Each death was quarantined as an individual misfortune. To connect them would have been to identify a pattern, and a pattern would have suggested a cause. A cause would have demanded responsibility, scrutiny, and change. In a league fighting for survival, that was unthinkable. These forgotten deaths are the silent footnotes to the roaring headlines of the 1930s. They are the ultimate evidence of the covenant these men unknowingly signed. They offered not just their health, but their very lives, as collateral for a weekly paycheck. The league accepted the offering, used it up, and when the worst happened, it turned away, hiding behind the convenient myth of the freak accident or the troubled soul. But these men were not freaks. They were products of a system, and their deaths, scattered and unconnected as they seemed, formed a pattern. A constellation of tragedy pointing directly back to the culture of the NFL in its formative years. A culture so silent about its dangers that even death could not make it speak the truth. A silence enforced not by owners or coaches, but by the players themselves, bound by a code that valued loyalty over survival and secrecy over everything. The most powerful rules are the ones never written down. In the 1930s NFL, alongside the official rulebook and the unspoken mandate of the officials, there existed a third, far more potent governing force: the code. This was not handed down from the league office or posted in the locker room. It was bred in the bone of the sport, transmitted through glances and grimaces, enforced not by referees but by the men who shared the trenches. It was a simple, brutal, and universally understood law. You did not speak of your pain. You did not question the methods. You did not betray the fraternity by admitting weakness or, worse, by implicating the team or the game in your own breakdown. This player-enforced culture of secrecy was the internal engine of the league's denial machine. It was more effective than any owner's memo or coach's threat could ever be, because it turned the players into their own jailers. The silence wasn't just imposed. It was volunteered, a sacrament in the religion of toughness. To understand the code, you must understand the locker room's social economy. Your worth was defined by your reliability, your durability, your willingness to be a gamer. Within that hierarchy, the lowest form of life was the complainer, the hypochondriac, the snitch, a player who voiced his pain too loudly, who sought too much medical attention, or who hinted that a hit was dirty or a practice too dangerous, was immediately marked. He was ostracized. Teammates would freeze him out, questioning his heart. Coaches would note his lack of grit. In a world where jobs hung by a thread, this social death was a prelude to actual release. You would be cut, and the reason would not be your injury, but your attitude. The message was clear. Your body's suffering was less important than the perception of your toughness. This created a culture of profound, performative stoicism. Men would laugh through broken teeth, joke about their own concussions, and wear their injuries as badges of honor, all to prove they were still within the circle of trust. This internal policing was devastatingly effective at suppressing the truth. A player with blinding headaches after a game would not report them, for fear of being labeled soft in the head. A man with a knee that buckled would tape it tighter and claim it was fine, because to admit otherwise was to risk his spot to the hungry rookie who said nothing. The code ensured that the full extent of the game's damage remained invisible, even to the teams themselves. Coaches and owners could genuinely claim they had no idea how hurt their players were, because the players, bound by this brotherhood of silence, deliberately hid it from them. The system created a perfect feedback loop of ignorance. Management believed the game was survivable because men kept playing through anything, and men kept playing through anything because management believed it was survivable. The code was the grease in that loop. The enforcement went beyond social shunning. There was a proactive element, a cultural practice of dismissing and ridiculing legitimate medical concern. If a player was slow to get up, a teammate's hand would yank him to his feet with a gruff, "Walk it off, you bum." Conversations about lasting pain were shut down with black humor. "What are you gonna do? Live forever?" The language itself was a tool of suppression. To give a voice to your suffering was to bitch, to whine, to cry. This vocabulary framed any admission of vulnerability as a moral failure, a betrayal of the group. The code thus weaponized masculinity, turning it against the individual's most basic instinct, self-preservation. It convinced men that ignoring a cracked rib was a sign of character, while attending to it was a sign of cowardice. The legacy of this silence is perhaps most eloquently told not by what the players said, but by what they never spoke of. In interviews with children and grandchildren of 1930s players, a common, haunting theme emerges: the void where the story should have been. A grandson of a Chicago Bears lineman told me he had hands like stone mallets, twisted and knotted. I asked him once about his worst injury. He just looked at me, shook his head, and said, "You don't want to know." Then he changed the subject. It was a wall. We never got past it. A daughter of a New York Giants back recalled, "He was a gentle man, but he had these terrible moods, these silences that could last for days. We knew it was from football, but he would never, ever talk about the game itself. It was like that part of his life happened to someone else, and he just carried the ghost of it." These are not stories of shared glory, but of inherited mystery. The code did not retire when the player did. It followed him home, sealing his trauma inside a vault of silence that his family could hear echoing but never open. This self-imposed vow of omerta served the league's interests perfectly, but it was ultimately a pact the players made with themselves. It was a survival mechanism within the microsociety of the team. To break the code was to become an outsider, and on a football team, the outsider did not survive. So they swallowed their pain, hid their symptoms, and laughed through the agony, building a wall of silence so high and so thick that the true cost of the game remained hidden for decades. They protected the secret, even from their own families, even from their future selves. The code ensured that the NFL's darkest truths would not be exposed by whistleblowers, but would have to be excavated, slowly and painfully, from the broken bodies and haunted minds of the men who lived by it. And while the players policed their own silence, the men who profited from their labor operated under a different, colder code, one written not in camaraderie, but in ledger books where the value of a player was calculated with ruthless precision, and his future was a column that simply ended at zero. To step off the muddy field and into the owner's box in the 1930s was to enter a different universe of risk and reward. The players gambled with their bodies. The owners gambled with capital. And in that calculus, the health of the former was a negligible variable in the survival equation of the latter. To understand why the NFL remained a slaughterhouse for so long, one must follow the money, or more accurately, the desperate lack of it. This was not a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. It was a collection of shaky, small businesses, many owned by men for whom the football franchise was a side venture, a passion project, or a speculative gamble. In their boardrooms and private correspondence, a cold, pragmatic logic prevailed. Investing in player safety was not just a low priority. It was seen as a frivolous, even foolish expense. The player was not an employee to be nurtured, but a depreciating asset to be utilized at maximum efficiency until replacement was required. The balance sheet, not the medical chart, dictated the terms of engagement. First, examine the typical franchise's financial picture. Margins were razor-thin. The Great Depression had eviscerated disposable income. Attendance was volatile, often dipping below 5,000 for non-marquee games. Broadcasting revenue was in its infancy and not a significant income stream. Many owners, like George Halas of the Bears or Tim Mara of the Giants, subsidized their teams with profits from other businesses, beer distribution, gambling interests, or legal practices. In this environment, every expenditure was scrutinized through a lens of pure survival. The cost of upgrading a rock-hard field with proper drainage and sod? Prohibitive. The cost of hiring a full-time, trained medical staff instead of a volunteer doctor? Pointless luxury. The cost of expanding the roster to allow players rest and recovery? Economically insane. From a purely financial standpoint, investing in safety offered no return on investment. A healthier player did not necessarily draw more fans. A safer game was not what the limited market was demanding. The product that sold was violence and toughness. Spending money to reduce that product's intensity made no business sense. This led to the core financial metaphor that governed the era: the player as a depreciating asset. In accounting, a piece of machinery is purchased, used until its value declines through wear and tear, and then discarded or replaced. The owners applied this model to human beings. They invested a small amount of capital, the player's salary, to acquire the asset. The asset's job was to produce on the field, generating wins that, hopefully, increased ticket sales. With every game, every practice, every hit, the asset depreciated. Bones became brittle, joints wore out, brains absorbed trauma. The owner's goal was to extract maximum production from the asset during its useful life, knowing that eventual breakdown was inevitable and, crucially, not his financial responsibility. When the asset broke down, when the knee gave out or the reflexes slowed, it was simply written off. There was no costly repair, long-term medical care. It was replaced with a new, cheaper, undepreciated asset, a rookie. The system was designed for turnover, not longevity. Investing in the asset's long-term health was bad business. It extended the period you were tied to a depreciating commodity. This mindset is chillingly revealed in the owner's own words, buried in meeting minutes and private letters. The minutes from league meetings in the mid-1930s are dominated by discussions of scheduling, gate receipt splits, and territorial rights. Player welfare is conspicuously, glaringly absent. When it is mentioned, it is often framed as a cost problem. There is a famous, though perhaps apocryphal, exchange attributed to a discussion about potentially mandating safer helmets. A prominent owner is said to have scoffed, "If we put cushions on their heads, we'll have to put cushions on their backsides too. We're selling football, not tiddlywinks." The sentiment, whether verbatim or not, captures the prevailing attitude. More concrete are letters between owners discussing player contracts. In one, an owner writes to another about a veteran seeking a raise, complaining, "He's got 3 good years left in him at most. Why would I pay more for a used part?" The language is unequivocally that of mechanics, not mentorship. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from internal discussions about insurance and disability. Proposals for even a minimal league-wide injury insurance plan were repeatedly voted down as too costly and administratively messy. The owners argued, not without a twisted logic, that providing such insurance would create a moral hazard. It would encourage players to fake or exaggerate injuries. Their solution was to provide nothing, forcing the player to carry his own risk. This wasn't just neglect. It was a calculated policy decision. It kept costs low and placed the entire burden of physical catastrophe on the individual, freeing the league from any lingering financial obligation once the player's useful life was over. The balance sheet remained clean. This economic reality is the skeleton key to the entire era. It explains the primitive equipment. Why invest in helmet research when the head inside it was a disposable instrument? It explains the lack of medical care. Why pay for a surgeon when the asset could be replaced for less than the cost of the operation? It explains the relentless play-through pain culture. It extended the asset's productive life. It explains the post-career abandonment. A fully depreciated asset has no book value. Every brutal facet of the 1930s NFL can be traced back to this cold, unemotional calculus of Depression-era capitalism. The owners were not cartoon villains. They were businessmen operating in a cutthroat, precarious market. And in that market, the humanity of the player was a liability, a sentimentality that threatened the bottom line. They viewed the carnage not with guilt, but with the detached concern of a factory owner watching a machine wear out. And as long as there was a line of new machines waiting at the gate, the production line would never stop. Yet, even within this rigid economic machine, a few rare individuals, doctors, writers, even the occasional coach, began to hear the strain in the gears and dared to speak a warning, their voices faint but persistent, challenging the very logic upon which the entire enterprise was built. The silence surrounding the NFL in the 1930s was not absolute. It was a heavy, deliberate quiet, but it was punctuated, however rarely, by the sound of a voice breaking ranks. These were not voices from the outside looking in with easy judgment. They were voices from within the ecosystem. A doctor who saw the broken men up close, a writer who saw past the myth-making, even a former player who dared to question the code. They were the first whistleblowers. In an era defined by the glorification of toughness, their warnings were not just unpopular. They were heretical. They suggested that the emperor had no clothes, that the spectacle was built on a foundation of preventable suffering. For their honesty, they were ridiculed, marginalized, and ignored. But their words, preserved like fossils in old medical journals and obscure columns, form a shocking record of prescient understanding. They saw the truth clearly, decades before science would catch up to their grim predictions. The most significant of these early voices belonged to a pathologist, not a sports writer. Dr. Harrison Martland of Newark, New Jersey, was the chief medical examiner. In the late 1920s, he began autopsying the brains of former boxers, publishing a landmark paper in 1928 that identified a condition he called punch-drunk syndrome. He described the tremors, the slurred speech, the cognitive decline. By the early 1930s, Martland had turned his attention to football. He had seen local players from professional and college teams, men who displayed symptoms eerily similar to the boxers he studied. In a 1933 medical journal, he made a direct, fearless connection. He wrote that football players, through repeated blows to the head, were susceptible to the same progressive brain trauma. He described the mechanism of the brain sloshing inside the skull. His warning was explicit and published in a scientific forum. The NFL's response was not to engage, but to ignore. Martland was not part of their world. He was a nuisance from the realm of academia. His findings required a medical infrastructure to address, and the league had none. So his work was filed away, a curiosity for specialists, while the players on the field continued to get their bell rung. In the world of letters, the most prominent critic was John R. Tunis, whose 1936 essay, The Great God Football, we have mentioned. But Tunis was not alone in his skepticism. Westbrook Pegler, a syndicated columnist known for his cranky conservatism, occasionally used his platform to question the sport's brutality. In a 1937 column, he wrote, "The game becomes less football and more a test of which group of men can better withstand being used as human battering rams. It is a wonder the ambulances do not line the field like taxis at a hotel." Pegler's criticism was couched in his general distaste for modern spectacle, but it cut to the core. Another writer, Paul Gallico, a former sports editor turned novelist, wrote a famous 1938 article titled, The Feel. In it, he admitted his own fear while trying out for a professional team, describing the violence as terrifying and dehumanizing. He concluded that fans loved football because it allowed them to experience violence vicariously, without risk. These writers were not calling for the abolition of the sport, but they were refusing to participate in its glorification. They were pointing at the man behind the curtain. The sporting press, deeply invested in the myth, largely dismissed them as sissies or intellectuals who didn't understand the warrior spirit of the game. Their critiques were labeled as the carping of outsiders who lacked the stomach for real competition. Perhaps the rarest and most powerful voices were those that came from within the fraternity itself. They were whispers, not shouts. A veteran player, nearing the end of his career, might take a rookie aside and tell him, "Save your money. This game will leave you with nothing." But to speak publicly was career suicide. One notable, quiet act of defiance came from Red Grange's own teammate, Chicago Bears center George Trafton. A fierce and respected player, Trafton was interviewed in 1934 about the increasing size and speed of players. He said bluntly, "The way the game is going, somebody is going to get killed out there, and it won't be an accident. It'll be because the game is too damn rough for the equipment we've got." For a current player, especially a star, to say this was astonishing. It was a crack in the code. Trafton's comment was printed, but it was treated as the grumbling of a veteran, not a valid safety critique. The league did not contact him for further insight. His warning was absorbed into the general noise of sports page commentary and forgotten. The backlash these individuals faced was a template for how the NFL would handle criticism for the next century. The strategy was not to debate, but to discredit and dismiss. Martland was an alarmist, a theorist who didn't understand the game. Tunis and Gallico were effete intellectuals, soy boys of their day, whose opinions reflected their own weakness, not the reality of sport. A player who spoke up was a malcontent, a clubhouse lawyer, his courage reframed as disloyalty. The league and its media allies wielded the potent weapon of masculinity. To express concern was to be less of a man. This shut down conversation before it could begin. It placed the burden of proof not on the league to demonstrate safety, but on the critic to prove their own toughness. It was a rhetorical trap that remained effective for decades. The tragedy, of course, is that every one of their warnings was prophetically accurate. Martland was describing CTE 80 years before it became a household term. Tunis and Pegler were diagnosing the sport's moral sickness, its exploitation of the human body for entertainment. Trafton was predicting the on-field fatalities and neurological disasters that would later dot the sport's history. They saw the destination clearly, but the train was already hurtling down the tracks, and the men at the controls had no interest in applying the brakes. These first whistleblowers were like sentinels shouting into a gathering storm. Their voices were carried away by the wind of commerce and the roaring crowd. But they left a record. They proved that the dangers were never a secret. They were an open secret, willfully ignored because acknowledging them would have required a fundamental and costly reinvention of the sport. The league chose consciously not to look. And as we close this examination of the 1930s, we must confront the full weight of that choice. For the decisions made in that decade, the cultural norms cemented, the economic models entrenched, did not vanish with the coming of a new decade or a world war. They became the league's DNA, a legacy written not in championship trophies, but in the very bodies and brains of the men who followed, a debt that would compound with terrifying interest. We have walked through the mud and the blood. We have sat in the cold locker rooms and ridden the endless trains. We have heard the silence that followed the roar. The story of the 1930s NFL is not a historical curiosity, a black and white prologue to a modern, polished game. It is the source code. The cultural norms forged in the desperation of the Great Depression, the glorification of violence, the commandment to play through pain, the systemic distrust of medicine, the economic coercion, the code of silence. These did not fade with the coming of the 1940s or the invention of the television contract. They became the league's genetic material. They were passed down season after season, coaching staff to coaching staff, veteran to rookie, woven into the very identity of what it meant to be a football player. The modern NFL's most profound crises, the CTE epidemic, the battles over painkillers, the disability lawsuits, the culture of deniability, are not accidents. They are the harvest. They are the legacy in the bone, passed from that first generation of men to every generation that followed. The most unbroken line runs directly from the head trauma of the 1930s to the CTE crisis that engulfed the league in the 21st century. When Dr. Harrison Martland published his findings on punch-drunk syndrome in boxers and speculated on football in 1933, he provided a map. The league chose not to read it. For the next 70 years, the NFL's approach to concussions would be a monument to the 1930s ethos. Deny, discredit, and dismiss. The get your bell rung protocol of the Depression era simply evolved. In the 1960s and 70s, it became the ding and the graded concussion system that still underestimated the injury. In the 1990s and 2000s, it became the league's own mild traumatic brain injury committee, producing flawed science that contradicted independent research, a direct echo of the owners ignoring Martland. The tactics were more sophisticated, but the impulse was identical. Protect the product, suppress the truth. The thousands of subconcussive hits endured by 1930s linemen in leather helmets were the first deposits in a neurological bank account that would later bankrupt the lives of men like Mike Webster and Junior So. The league's subsequent decades of denial were only possible because the foundation of denial was poured so deep and so strong in the 1930s, when acknowledging the problem would have meant questioning the sport's very right to exist. The cultural commandment to play through pain metastasized into a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical nightmare. The locker room injection of the 1930s, the shot of procaine or morphine from the black bag, was the primitive ancestor of the systemic, institutionalized pain management that would lead to the opioid crisis among retired players. The ethos never changed. Pain is the enemy to be vanquished, not a signal to be heeded. What was once a crude shot from a team trainer became a regimented distribution of powerful pills like Vicodin and OxyContin, handed out like candy in flight bags, creating dependencies that ruined lives long after the cheering stopped. The economic coercion remained. 2. Playing hurt wasn't just about toughness. It was about keeping your job, a reality as true in 1995 as it was in 1935. The league's warrior culture, so celebrated by marketing departments, is not a spontaneous expression of athletic spirit. It is a cultivated business strategy, born in an era when warriors were cheap, replaceable, and silent. The financial model, too, carries the DNA of the 1930s. The concept of the player as a depreciating asset evolved but never disappeared. The fight for a pension, for disability benefits, for long-term healthcare has been a bloody, decades-long battle precisely because the original owner's philosophy, that a team's responsibility ends with the last game check, proved so durable. The financial model, too, carries the DNA of the 1930s. The concept of the player as a depreciating asset evolved but never disappeared. The fight for a pension, for disability benefits, for long-term healthcare has been a bloody, decades-long battle precisely because the original owner's philosophy, that a team's responsibility ends with the last game check, proved so durable. The NFL Players Association was formed in direct opposition to this very notion. Every gain, every collective bargaining agreement, has been a clawing back of humanity from a system designed to view men as capital. The heartbreaking struggles of pre-1993 retirees to get disability approval for football-related ailments are the direct descendants of the 1930s player who was sent home with a broken body and an empty pocket. The system was built to discard, and changing that architecture has required dismantling it brick by brick against relentless resistance. Perhaps the most insidious inheritance is the psychological one, the code of silence. The locker room law that ostracized complainers in 1938 is the same culture that, in 2010, made a player think twice about reporting concussion symptoms to an independent spotter. The fear is different, not of being cut so much as being sidelined, losing your starting role, letting down your brothers, but the root is identical. The group's expectation overrides the individual's health. This internalized policing is why, even with modern protocols, players still hide injuries, still take Toradol shots to mask pain, still feel the ghost of that old, hard command. Asterisk, suck it up. We need you. Asterisk, the whistleblower, whether it was John R. Tunis in 1936 or a team doctor in 2000, still faces the same machinery of ridicule and marginalization. The league's entire history of handling danger is a history of managing information, of controlling the narrative, a practice perfected when the only narratives were in newspapers and newsreels. When we look at the modern NFL, a league of breathtaking athleticism, sophisticated strategy, and global influence, we must see it as a towering structure built on this old, fractured foundation. The light shows and the jumbotrons, the advanced analytics and the genetic freaks, all rest upon the bedrock laid by men like Joe Donahue, Mel Hine, and the forgotten thousands who played in silence and died in obscurity. Their suffering was the capital that purchased the league's future. Every safety protocol, every rule change protecting the quarterback, every lawsuit settled is a belated, partial repair to a system that was engineered to be unsafe, because in its formative years, safety was a cost with no financial return. The 1930s did not give us football. They gave us a specific, ruthless template for professional football. A collision sport where the collision was the product and the human cost was externalized. The league has spent nearly a century trying to retrofit safety and compassion onto a machine designed without them. It has made progress, undeniable progress. But to understand why the change is so slow, why the resistance is so fierce, why the past constantly haunts the present in courtrooms and brain labs, you must start here, in the decade where it all began. The legacy is not just in the record books or the Hall of Fame busts. It is in the trembling hands, the forgotten names, the chronic pain, and the damaged minds. It is a legacy written not in ink, but in trauma. And before we can consider what the future of this game should be, we must finally, and with clear eyes, hold the full weight of what its past truly was. This journey began with a silence, the silence after the roar, the private quiet where a man tallies the debt his body has come to owe. We have followed that silence back to its source, to the muddy fields and rusted trains of the 1930s. We began with individual stories of suffering, with Joe Donahue and Jack McCarthy, men whose names faded from the headlines long before their pain subsided. But as we walked through their world, a system came into focus. Their suffering was not random. It was not bad luck. It was the logical, predictable output of a machine engineered for a single purpose, to produce a spectacle of violence at the lowest possible cost. What we have witnessed is not merely a history of a sport's brutal childhood. It is a forensic audit of a business model, an examination of how a league, and the society that embraced it, decided what a man's body, his mind, and his future were worth. The 1930s were not a quaint, brutal past from which we have gracefully evolved. They were the active, deliberate creation of a template, a blueprint for exploitation. Every bolt in this machine, the economic coercion, the medical neglect, the glorified violence, the internalized silence, was carefully, if not consciously, fitted into place. This was the founding covenant. The league would provide a thrilling product, the player would bear the entire risk, and the public would be sold a myth so powerful it would anesthetize their conscience. The moral failure we must confront is layered. It belongs first to the owners, who viewed human beings as depreciating assets. They made cold, rational business calculations in an era of scarcity, and those calculations deemed safety a superfluous expense. But the failure extends beyond the boardroom. It includes the sports writers and newsreel narrators who performed the alchemy of turning trauma into legend, who taught us to cheer for the very thing that was destroying the men we claimed to admire. It includes a medical establishment that, with few exceptions, remained willfully blind, dismissing the evidence before their eyes. And, however uncomfortable it is to admit, the failure also belongs to us, the audience. We accepted the terms. We bought the tickets and believed the myth. We mistook desperation for courage and silent suffering for strength. We created the demand for which this brutal supply was the only answer. A society grappling with the depression found in these gladiators a symbol of resilience, but we failed to ask what our symbolism was costing the symbols themselves. The modern player, the millionaire athlete in a helmet of space-age polymer, steps onto a field haunted by this legacy. He inherits a sport whose culture was forged in a crucible of unrelenting hardship. When he is told to be a warrior, he is hearing the echo of the Iron Man myth. A standard set when leaving the field meant losing your livelihood. When he hesitates to report a concussion, he is feeling the gravitational pull of the code of silence, a law written in the 1930s locker room. When he is offered a Toradol shot to numb a serious injury, he is confronting the direct descendant of the black bag's syringe, the same philosophy that pain is an obstacle to be chemically demolished, not a warning to be heeded. The lawsuits he will read about, the retired legends struggling with dementia, the debates over disability, these are not modern anomalies. They are the mature fruit of the seeds planted 90 years ago. The modern player operates with more knowledge, more power, and more wealth, but he does so within an institutional psyche that was fundamentally shaped by the principle that the player is ultimately disposable. His fight for agency over his own health and future is a fight against the deepest, oldest currents in the professional game. So what do we do with this legacy? How do we reconcile our love for this magnificent, intricate, and deeply violent game with the knowledge of its foundational sins? The first step is to reject nostalgia. There were no good old days. There were only days when the cost was hidden more effectively, when the men who paid it had less voice, and when we, the audience, asked fewer questions. The second step is to listen to the silence we started with. To understand that the history of the NFL is not just a record of championships and iconic plays, but a ledger of quiet suffering. A ledger that is still being written. Every rule change toward safety, every improved pension benefit, every honest admission about CTE, is a belated entry on the other side of that ledger, an attempt to balance accounts that have been delinquent for nearly a century. The true price of what we celebrate is not measured in television contracts or merchandise sales. It is measured in the lifetimes of pain that extend from those early fields. It is tallied in the knees and hips and spines that gave out decades before nature intended. It is accounted for in the memories that slipped away, the personalities that fractured, the families that inherited a ghost. The game we watch on Sunday afternoons is built, quite literally, on the broken bodies of those men. They are the sub-basement of this towering cultural edifice. We walk on the marble floors of modern stadiums, rarely thinking of the cracked bedrock far below. This is not a call to abandon football. It is a call to see it clearly, to watch it with our eyes fully open to its beauty and its brutality, its incredible human achievement and its profound human cost. It is a demand for accountability that matches the scale of the sacrifice. The league, which now enjoys profits beyond the wildest dreams of those Depression-era owners, has a moral and financial debt to every generation that built it, starting with the very first. That debt cannot be fully repaid, but it must be acknowledged and honored without ceasing, through relentless research, through compassionate and uncomplicated care for retired players, through a culture that finally, unequivocally, prioritizes the man over the asset. We end where we began, with a single player, in the quiet after the crowd has gone home. In the 1930s, he was alone with his pain, abandoned by the institution he served. Our responsibility, born of this knowledge, is to ensure he is no longer alone, that his successors are not left with the same silence. The legacy in the bone is a heavy one. It is a legacy of trauma passed down through the decades. But legacy is not fate, can be altered, can be healed. It begins with remembrance, with speaking the names, telling the full stories, and recognizing that the most important stat of all is not yards gained or titles won, but the life lived after the final whistle blows. The game's future depends not on forgetting its brutal past, but on finally, and forever, deciding to build something better upon it. The whistle has blown on the era of silence. What we do next is the only thing that matters.